Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of Islamic thought and we delve into texts that have shaped the intellectual landscape for centuries. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a truly monumental work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, by the renowned scholar Imam al-Ghazali. Just the title alone sparks curiosity, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a title that grabs your attention and hints at the intense intellectual debate that lies within. Imam al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111, was a towering figure in Islamic intellectual history, a polymath whose works span philosophy, theology, jurisprudence, and mysticism. His writings continue to be studied and debated to this day, and The Incoherence of the Philosophers stands as one of his most influential and controversial works.
Before we dive into the incoherence, could you maybe paint a picture of the intellectual scene that al-Ghazali was engaging with? Who were these philosophers, and what were their ideas that al-Ghazali found so problematic?
The philosophers al-Ghazali critiques belong to a school of thought heavily influenced by ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle and his followers. They sought to reconcile Islamic theology with philosophical reasoning, often drawing on Aristotelian concepts of logic, metaphysics, and cosmology. This led to some interpretations of Islamic doctrines that differed from traditional understandings.
So it's not that they were outright denying Islam, but their methods and conclusions were kind of creating ripples in the traditional understanding.
Yeah, it's kind of like a theological remix that wasn't sitting well with everyone.
That's a great analogy.
Imagine a remix that takes a familiar melody and adds in unfamiliar instruments and rhythms. It might be intriguing, but it could also sound jarring to those accustomed to the original. Similarly, these philosophers were introducing new ways of thinking about God, the universe, and the human soul. And some of these ideas were clashing with established theological interpretations.
And al-Ghazali stepped in essentially saying, hold on a minute, this remix needs some serious revisions.
Exactly, and he does so with his characteristic brilliance and intellectual rigor. He saw these philosophical interpretations as potentially misleading, especially for those who might not have the grounding to critically evaluate them. He was concerned that these ideas, if accepted uncritically, could lead to a weakening of faith and a distortion of Islamic teachings.
So it was a matter of safeguarding the core tenets of Islam, ensuring they weren't lost in this philosophical fusion. Did al-Ghazali have any personal experiences that might have fueled his concerns?
Yes, indeed. Interestingly, before writing The Incoherence, al-Ghazali underwent a period of intense spiritual crisis. He doubted everything. He questioned the reliability of his senses, the validity of different fields of knowledge, and even the very foundations of reason and logic. He describes this intellectual and spiritual struggle in his autobiography, Deliverance from Error.
Wow. So he wasn't just theorizing about the dangers of intellectual uncertainty, he had lived it. It's like that saying, you can't truly understand someone's journey until you've walked a mile in their shoes.
Precisely. And his personal journey through doubt and skepticism deeply informed his critique of the philosophers. He understood the allure of philosophical ideas, but he also knew firsthand how easily they could lead astray if not carefully examined and grounded in a solid theological framework.
So imagine you're someone living in al-Ghazali's time. You're hearing these new philosophical interpretations. You might be thinking, this makes sense. But then al-Ghazali comes along, having wrestled with these ideas himself. He's like, hey, let's take a deeper look. Consider the implications. See if these interpretations truly align with our faith.
That's a great way to put it. And he doesn't just dismiss the philosophers' arguments outright. He presents them in their strongest form, demonstrating a deep understanding of their intricacies. Only then does he meticulously dissect them, pointing out their logical flaws and their inconsistencies with Islamic teachings.
Okay, so he's approaching this like a skilled debater, not just saying you're wrong, but rather, let's analyze your argument and see where it leads us. He's essentially modeling critical thinking for his audience.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that makes The Incoherence such a brilliant work. It's not just a theological treatise, it's a lesson in intellectual rigor and critical engagement. Al-Ghazali wanted his readers to think for themselves, to not be swayed by seemingly compelling arguments without carefully considering their foundations and implications.
Okay, so we have this fascinating backdrop. Al-Ghazali, a towering intellect wrestling with doubt, stepping in to challenge these new philosophical interpretations that were causing a stir. Before we delve into the specifics of those philosophical arguments, could you give us a sneak peek into the structure of The Incoherence? How does he lay out his critique?
The Incoherence of the Philosophers is structured around a meticulous examination of 20 specific philosophical doctrines prevalent at the time. He carefully categorizes them, deeming 17 to be heretical innovations and 3 to be utterly incompatible with Islam.
Wow, that's a systematic takedown. So he's not just randomly critiquing ideas, he's created a framework, a hierarchy of philosophical errors, so to speak.
That's right. He takes a structured approach, systematically dissecting each doctrine and revealing its flaws. This demonstrates the depth of his engagement with these ideas and his commitment to presenting a comprehensive and coherent counterargument. He wasn't just throwing out opinions, he was constructing a well-reasoned and meticulously supported critique.
Al-Ghazali, the meticulous architect of arguments. This structure definitely hints at the intensity of the debate.
Imagine a courtroom drama where al-Ghazali is presenting a case against these philosophical doctrines, meticulously laying out his evidence and dismantling the opposing arguments point by point. It's a battle of ideas, and al-Ghazali is a formidable opponent.
Okay, so the stage is set, the players are introduced, the structure is laid out. Now let's dive into the heart of the matter, those key philosophical arguments and al-Ghazali's critiques. Where do we begin?
Let's start with one of the most fundamental and controversial topics, the eternity of the world. Philosophers of al-Ghazali's era, heavily influenced by Greek thought, argued that the world must be eternal, meaning it has always existed and had no beginning.
Hold on. That seems counterintuitive. Doesn't it seem more logical that the world had a starting point, a moment of creation?
That's what makes this debate so intriguing. Their argument for the world's eternity rested on their understanding of God's nature. They believed that an eternal being like God could not create something within the framework of time. Creating within time would imply a change in God, a shift from a state of not having created to having created, which they saw as conflicting with God's absolute and unchanging perfection.
So they're basically saying that if God created the world at a specific point in time, what was he doing before that? It's like asking what was north of the North Pole.
Precisely. The concept of before creation becomes meaningless if God is outside the constraints of time. To them, the idea of God acting within time seemed to limit him, suggesting he was subject to change, which was incompatible with their understanding of his eternal and unchanging nature.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic, but how does this idea of an eternal world square with the Islamic concept of creation?
That's precisely the tension al-Ghazali points out. He argues that the philosopher's stance contradicts the Quran, which clearly states that God created the world. But he doesn't stop there. He also challenges their philosophical reasoning, demonstrating that their logic is flawed and leads to contradictions.
So he's not just saying, nope, the Quran says otherwise. He's meeting them on their own philosophical turf and saying, actually, even by your own standards of logic, this argument doesn't hold up.
You got it. He's not afraid to engage in robust philosophical debate, using both logic and revelation to support his arguments. He points out that the philosopher's rigid understanding of causality, the relationship between cause and effect, is what leads them astray. They seem to restrict God's actions within a linear time frame, which limits his power.
So how does al-Ghazali counter their argument? Does he propose an alternative understanding of causality that allows for both God's eternity and the creation of the world in time?
He does, and he uses a brilliant analogy that's both relatable and thought-provoking. Think of the act of writing. You decide in your mind to write something down. That decision exists in your mind before the actual physical act of writing takes place. But the writing, the physical manifestation of your thought, is brought about by your will, your intention. It's brought into being by your choice, even though your will, your capacity to choose, is not bound by time in the same way the physical act of writing is.
So he's saying that even though our will or intention might exist outside of a linear time frame, it can still bring about events within time. It's like the timeless will ripples outward, creating waves within the ocean of time.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and this analogy gets to the heart of al-Ghazali's argument. He's saying that God, the eternal being, possesses a timeless will that can act within time to bring about creation. It's not a contradiction, it's a demonstration of God's power and creative freedom. He's not bound by the limitations of linear time, but he can choose to act within it.
Okay, I'm starting to see how al-Ghazali is reframing the whole discussion, shifting the focus from a rigid understanding of causality to a more dynamic view of God's will and his power to act within time. He's saying, look, you're limiting God with your narrow definition of cause and effect.
Exactly, and he takes this argument even further, pointing out that the philosopher's view of an eternal world actually leads to some pretty mind-boggling contradictions.
Like what? Give me an example of these contradictions.
Well, consider this. If there is no beginning to time and the world has eternally existed, How do we distinguish between similar events that occur at different points in this endless chain of time? For example, if the Earth has eternally revolved around the sun, then each revolution is essentially identical to every other revolution. It's an infinite loop with no real differentiation.
So every sunrise, every sunset, every moment in history is just an endless repetition of the same events. It's like being stuck in a cosmic Groundhog Day scenario.
That's a great way to visualize it. And for al-Ghazali, this undermines the concept of divine will and purpose. If everything is eternally recurring, what role does God's choice, his intention, play in the unfolding of events? It suggests a universe devoid of meaning and direction, which contradicts the Islamic understanding of God as the all-knowing, all-wise creator.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Does this idea of God's will acting within time suggest that our free will, our capacity to choose, is somehow limited or predetermined?
That's a fantastic question, and one that Islamic theologians have grappled with for centuries. The relationship between divine predestination and human free will is complex, and we could probably spend an entire deep dive exploring the various perspectives on this issue.
Let's save that for another deep dive. But I have to admit, this discussion is already making me rethink my own assumptions about time causality and even the nature of God's power. It's like al-Ghazali is inviting us to step outside of our limited perspectives and consider a more expansive view of reality.
I agree, and that's the beauty of engaging with these profound thinkers. They challenge our assumptions and push us to expand our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So we've seen how al-Ghazali masterfully tackles this foundational argument about the eternity of the world, but I know this is just the tip of the iceberg. He goes on to critique several other key philosophical doctrines, right? What's next on our agenda?
Next, we'll delve into another fascinating and controversial topic, the nature of God's knowledge. This is where al-Ghazali really digs into the philosophers' interpretations and reveals their implications for our understanding of God's justice, mercy, and relationship to humanity. Get ready for another mind-bending journey. Welcome back to our deep dive into Imam al-Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers, where we are exploring this fascinating world of Islamic philosophy and theology.
We've just begun to scratch the surface of al-Ghazali's powerful critiques, and I'm already feeling like my brain is doing some serious mental gymnastics.
That's the beauty of al-Ghazali's work. It challenges us to think deeply about concepts we might take for granted.
So last time we delved into al-Ghazali's challenge to the philosopher's view on the eternity of the world. He argued that God, the eternal being, can act within time, creating the world through his timeless will. He even used the example of writing to illustrate how a timeless intention can manifest within time. It was mind-blowing.
His argument certainly pushes us to reconsider our usual assumptions about time and causality. And as we journey further into the incoherence, we'll see how this theme of God's active will continues to play a central role in al-Ghazali's critiques.
Okay, so tell me, where are we headed next on this intellectual adventure? What other philosophical doctrines did al-Ghazali find problematic?
Next, we're going to explore al-Ghazali's critique of the philosopher's understanding of God's knowledge. This is where things get really interesting, as it touches on the very heart of how we relate to God, his awareness of us, his involvement in our lives, and his capacity to respond to our individual needs and prayers.
Okay, now we're getting into some deep theological waters. I'm already intrigued. What exactly did the philosophers believe about God's knowledge that al-Ghazali found so objectionable?
Well, the philosophers, drawing on Greek philosophical ideas, particularly from Aristotle, made a distinction between knowing universals and knowing particulars.
Universals and particulars. Could you unpack those terms for me? I need a little refresher course in Philosophy 101.
Of course. Think of it this way. A universal is like a general concept or category. It's the big picture idea. For example, the concept of humanity is a universal. It encompasses all the essential characteristics of what it means to be human. Our capacity for reason, our emotions, our social nature.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So humanity is the universal. What about particulars? How do they fit in?
A particular, on the other hand, is a specific instance of that universal. It's the individual expression of that general concept. So you, with all your unique qualities, experiences, and personality traits, are a particular instance of the universal humanity.
Ah, okay. So universals are like the blueprint, and particulars are the unique buildings constructed for that blueprint. Each one different, yet sharing the same fundamental essence.
That's a great way to visualize it. Now, the philosophers argued that God, being perfect, unchanging, and eternal, could only know universals. He knows the concept of human, but not individual humans. He knows the concept of tree, but not each specific tree.
Wait, So they're saying God doesn't know me personally?
It,
That's a pretty radical idea.
it is a bold claim, and it's precisely this idea that al-Ghazali challenges so vehemently. He argues that this view of God's knowledge as limited to universals has profound theological implications, and not in a good way.
Okay, I can see where this is going. If God doesn't know the specifics of our lives, our struggles, our joys, our individual choices, then how can he possibly be just or merciful? How can he respond to our prayers or guide us on our unique paths? It paints a picture of a rather distant and impersonal God, doesn't it?
That's exactly what al-Ghazali argues. He says that if God doesn't know the particulars, then how can he be truly aware of our actions, judge us fairly, or reward and punish us accordingly? The whole concept of divine justice and mercy seems to crumble if God is only aware of abstract concepts and not the specific realities of our lives.
It's like saying a judge can only consider the general laws of a society, but not the specific circumstances of each case. It wouldn't make for a very just legal system.
That's a great analogy. Al-Ghazali argues that the philosopher's view diminishes God's active role in the world and creates a gap between him and his creation.
So how does al-Ghazali counter this argument? Does he simply appeal to the Quran and say, look, it clearly states that God knows everything?
He does use the Quran as support, pointing out the numerous verses that describe God's intimate knowledge of our thoughts, actions, and even our hidden intentions. But he doesn't stop there. He also tackles the issue on a philosophical level, using reason and logic to dismantle the philosopher's claims.
Okay, I love that he's not afraid to engage on both fronts, theological and philosophical. So what's his philosophical counterargument? How does he challenge their logic?
Al-Ghazali uses a powerful analogy to human knowledge. He says, look, if our limited human minds are capable of grasping both universals and particulars, if we can know both the concept of humanity and the specifics of an individual person, then why should God, with his infinite knowledge, be limited to knowing only universals?
It's like saying, if I, with my finite mind, can know both the general rules of chess and the specific moves of each piece in this particular game, then surely God, with his infinite intellect, can know both the universal laws of the universe and the specific details of my life.
Precisely. He's challenging the philosopher's logic, pointing out a kind of double standard. If we, with our finite and imperfect minds, can achieve this level of knowledge, then surely God, with his limitless and perfect intellect, can too.
It's like he's saying don't underestimate God's knowledge by comparing it to our limited human understanding.
Yes. Al-Ghazali is arguing that God's knowledge is not just quantitatively greater than ours, it's also qualitatively different. He's emphasizing that God's knowledge encompasses all things, both the general and the specific, in a way that transcends our human categories of understanding.
Okay, so he's not just defending God's omniscience. He's actually expanding our conception of what divine knowledge entails. It's not just about knowing facts. It's about knowing in a way that encompasses all things in all their detail, in a way that we can't even fully comprehend.
That's a great way to put it. And this discussion of God's knowledge leads us to another fascinating aspect of al-Ghazali's critique, the question of divine attributes. How do we understand the qualities and characteristics that we ascribe to God? Are they separate from his essence, or are they somehow intertwined?
Okay, now we're getting into some seriously heady stuff. I'm ready to dive in. What was the philosopher's take on divine attributes?
Well, they held a view known as divine simplicity. This concept emphasizes God's absolute unity and oneness. They argued that God is so perfectly one that his attributes, things like knowledge, power, and will, are not distinct from his essence. They are essentially identical to his being.
So instead of seeing God as possessing different qualities or attributes, they're saying that God is those qualities. It's like saying a fire is not hot, it just is heat itself.
That's a great analogy, and you can see how philosophically this is an attempt to avoid any kind of complexity or multiplicity in the divine. They wanted to preserve God's absolute oneness and avoid any suggestion that he is composed of different parts or elements.
It's like they're striving for the ultimate theological minimalism, reducing God to the purest, most undifferentiated essence. But doesn't that create some problems? I mean, it seems to strip God of any meaningful attributes, making him more like an abstract concept than a personal God who interacts with his creation.
That's precisely al-Ghazali's critique. He argues that if God's attributes are not distinct from his essence, then they cease to have any real meaning. It's like saying a tree is not tall, it just is tallness. The concept of tallness has no meaning unless it's describing a quality of something, a tree in this case. Similarly, al-Ghazali argues that attributes like knowledge power and will only have meaning if they are qualities or characteristics that God possesses.
So for al-Ghazali, God is not just an abstract concept, a singular essence. He is a being who possesses distinct attributes that allow him to interact with the world, to create, to know, to judge, to love, to be merciful.
Exactly. Al-Ghazali argues that the philosopher's view, while well-intentioned in its attempt to preserve God's unity, ultimately undermines our understanding of God's active role in the world.
It's like they've created a God who is so simple
Huh.
that he's become almost inert, unable to engage with his creation in a meaningful way.
That's a great way to summarize it. And for al-Ghazali, this was unacceptable. He believed that God is not just a static, abstract entity, but a dynamic, living God who interacts with his creation through his attributes, through his will, his knowledge, and his power.
It seems like we're seeing a recurring theme here. Al-Ghazali challenging philosophical interpretations that he sees as limiting God's power and action in the world.
You're absolutely right. And this brings us to another crucial area where this theme plays out, the relationship between causality and miracles.
Okay, so we've talked about God's knowledge and attributes. Now we're getting into miracles. This is where things get really interesting, especially for someone like me who loves to hear stories of the extraordinary and seemingly impossible. Did the philosophers even believe in miracles, given their emphasis on reason and natural law?
That's a great question. And the answer is a bit more complex than a simple yes or no. The philosophers, influenced by their understanding of the natural world as operating according to fixed laws, had a nuanced perspective on miracles. They didn't deny that extraordinary events could occur, but they hesitated to attribute them to supernatural intervention.
So they weren't outright miracle deniers, but they were skeptical. They probably wouldn't be convinced by a story about someone walking on water or parting a sea.
That's probably an accurate assessment. They lean towards interpreting what we might call miracles as natural phenomena that we simply don't yet understand. They believe that there was a natural explanation for everything, even if we haven't discovered it yet.
So like a magician's trick, it appears to defy the laws of physics, but there's a hidden mechanism, a sleight of hand, that makes it work. We just need to figure out the trick.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. The philosophers might argue that what we perceive as a miracle is simply an event whose natural causes are beyond our current scientific understanding.
So they're not ruling out the possibility that there are things out there that science hasn't yet explained, but they're hesitant to jump to supernatural conclusions. They're like the ultimate skeptics, always looking for the rational explanation.
That's a good way to summarize their approach. And this perspective, of course, had a significant impact on how they interpreted Scripture, particularly accounts of miracles in the Quran. They might interpret these accounts allegorically as moral lessons or metaphors rather than literal events.
So instead of seeing the parting of the Red Sea as a literal event, they might interpret it as a symbolic representation of overcoming obstacles or escaping from oppression. They're essentially demythologizing the scriptures, looking for the deeper meaning beyond the literal narrative.
That's right. And this approach, while intellectually stimulating, creates some tension with traditional Islamic understandings of God's relationship to the world and his power to intervene in extraordinary ways.
It seems like they're putting God in a box, limiting his actions to the realm of natural law, stripping away the element of awe and wonder that often accompanies miracles. It's like they're saying God can only work within the boundaries we've set for him.
You've hit upon the core of al-Ghazali's critique. He vehemently rejects this limited view of God's power. He argues that the philosophers, with their rigid adherence to natural law, have essentially denied God's ability to act freely in the world. They've reduced him to a passive observer, bound by the rules of the game, unable to change the course of events in a way that transcends those rules.
So how does al-Ghazali counter this argument? Does he deny the existence of natural laws altogether? Does he say, nope, it's all magic and miracles all the time?
Al-Ghazali's response is both brilliant and nuanced. He doesn't deny the regularity of the natural world or the existence of natural laws. In fact, he acknowledges that these laws are essential for the functioning of the universe. But he argues that these laws are not the ultimate explanation. They are not the end of the story.
So he's not throwing out science or reason, but he's saying there's more to the picture. It's like saying that the rules of grammar are important for writing a sentence, but they don't explain the inspiration or the creativity that goes into crafting a poem.
That's a fantastic analogy. Al-Ghazali argues that natural laws are simply habitual patterns that God has established. They're like the regular rhythms of creation, the predictable ways in which God's will manifests in the world. But he's not bound by those patterns. He can choose to act in ways that transcend them, in ways that we perceive as miraculous.
Okay, so he's not saying that natural laws are wrong or that they don't exist. He's saying they're not the whole story. They're not the ultimate cause. There's a higher order at play, a divine will, that can both establish those laws and, when necessary, transcend them.
Precisely. And this understanding opens up the possibility of miracles without denying the order and regularity of the natural world. Al-Ghazali is essentially saying that God is the author of both the Book of Nature and the Book of Revelation, and sometimes those books tell stories that seem to defy our expectations. But those stories are not contradictions. They're simply different expressions of the same divine will.
It's a subtle but profound shift in perspective. It allows for both the awe-inspiring moments of divine intervention and the everyday wonders of a world governed by natural laws. This is like saying that God can both write a beautiful symphony and make sure the orchestra plays in tune.
Exactly. And it speaks to al-Ghazali's ability to weave together seemingly disparate concepts, to reconcile faith and reason, to embrace both the extraordinary and the ordinary as expressions of God's boundless power and wisdom.
Wow, this discussion is really making me rethink my own understanding of miracles. It's not about rejecting science or reason, but about recognizing the limits of our current understanding and acknowledging that there might be forces at work in the universe that we haven't even begun to comprehend.
I agree. And this open-mindedness, this willingness to consider perspectives that challenge our assumptions, is, I think, one of the most valuable lessons we can learn from al-Ghazali. He invites us to approach the world with both curiosity and humility, recognizing that our knowledge is always partial, always evolving, and always subject to revision.
This has been a mind-expanding exploration so far, and I know there's so much more to uncover. I'm eager to continue our deep dive into al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers to see what other intellectual treasures await us.
Let's continue our journey. We'll delve into his thoughts on the human soul next.
Welcome back to Echoes of Ihsan. I feel like we've been on this incredible intellectual roller coaster exploring the depths of Imam al-Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it? We've witnessed al-Ghazali's meticulous dismantling of philosophical arguments, his clever use of analogies, and his unwavering commitment to defending the core principles of Islam.
We've seen how he challenged the philosophers' views on the eternity of the world, the nature of God's knowledge, and the concept of divine attributes. It's like he's carefully peeling back layers of philosophical assumptions, revealing the potential pitfalls and inconsistencies lurking beneath the surface.
He's like a master chef deconstructing a complex dish to understand the individual ingredients and how they contribute to the overall flavor. And in doing so, he's not just critiquing, he's offering a richer, more nuanced understanding of these profound concepts.
So far, it's clear that al-Ghazali wasn't pulling any punches. He took on some of the biggest names in philosophy and didn't shy away from pointing out what he saw as their errors. But I'm curious, how did the philosophical world react to his critiques? Did they just accept defeat and slink away in silence?
Oh, not at all. In fact, al-Ghazali's work sparked even more debate and discussion, setting the stage for a fascinating intellectual back and forth that continues to resonate even today.
So it wasn't a knockout punch, but more like the opening volley in a long and epic battle of ideas.
Exactly. Think of it as a lively tennis match with al-Ghazali serving up some powerful arguments, and the philosophers returning serve with their own counterpoints. The ball goes back and forth, each side pushing the other to refine their arguments and deepen their understanding of the issues at stake.
This sounds like my kind of intellectual showdown. I'm ready to see how this philosophical match unfolds. Who were some of the key players on the other side of the net, so to speak? Which philosopher stepped up to challenge al-Ghazali's critiques?
One of the most prominent figures to respond to al-Ghazali was a brilliant Andalusian philosopher named Ibn Rushd, who lived about a century after al-Ghazali. He was a staunch defender of Aristotelian philosophy, and he saw al-Ghazali's critiques as a serious threat to the intellectual integrity of philosophy itself.
Ibn Rushd, the champion of Aristotle. Now that's a name I recognize. He was a major figure in medieval philosophy, known for his insightful commentaries on Aristotle's works. I can only imagine how he must have reacted to al-Ghazali's critique of the philosophical tradition he held so dear.
He definitely didn't hold back. In fact, Ibn Rushd wrote a point-by-point rebuttal to The Incoherence of the Philosophers, aptly titled The Incoherence of the Incoherence. He meticulously dissects al-Ghazali's arguments, accusing him of misrepresenting the philosopher's views, employing faulty logic, and ultimately undermining the pursuit of truth itself.
Wow, the incoherence of the incoherence. That's some serious philosophical shade-throwing. It sounds like Ibn Rushd wasn't just defending specific philosophical doctrines, he was defending the whole enterprise of philosophy itself. It's like he's saying, hey, philosophy is a valid way of seeking truth, and you can't just dismiss it with theological hand-waving.
That's a great way to capture the spirit of Ibn Rushd's response. He believed that philosophy, when properly understood and practiced, could actually enhance and deepen religious understanding. He saw al-Ghazali's critiques as a kind of intellectual overreach, an attempt to limit the scope of philosophical inquiry and to subordinate reason to revelation.
So it's more than just a disagreement about specific doctrines. It's a clash of worldviews, a fundamental difference in how they see the role of reason in relation to faith.
You hit the nail on the head. This clash of worldviews plays out in their differing interpretations of the Quran, particularly when it comes to passages that seem to conflict with reason or established philosophical principles. Al-Ghazali, as we've seen, often favored allegorical interpretations of such passages, suggesting that the deeper meaning lies beyond the literal words. Ibn Rushd, on the other hand, insisted on taking the Quranic text literally whenever possible, arguing that reason should be used to harmonize seemingly contradictory passages rather than to explain them away.
So al-Ghazali is emphasizing the importance of context interpretation and the limitations of human reason when trying to grasp divine truths. Ibn Rushd is championing the clarity and authority of the revealed text, arguing that reason can help us unlock its deeper meaning. It's like they're approaching the Quran from two different angles, each illuminating different aspects of its richness and complexity.
Exactly. And this difference in approach has significant implications for how they address specific theological questions. For example, think back to our discussion of God's knowledge. Al-Ghazali objected to the philosopher's view that God only knows universals, not particulars. He argued that this view undermined God's justice, mercy, and responsiveness to individual human beings. Ibn Rushd, however, countered by saying that al-Ghazali was misrepresenting the philosopher's position.
Wait, how is al-Ghazali misrepresenting their position? Did they explicitly say that God only knows universals?
Well, Ibn Rushd argued that the philosophers weren't denying God's knowledge of particulars. Instead, he said they were trying to articulate a more nuanced understanding of how God knows things. Remember our discussion of divine simplicity, the idea that God is so perfectly one that his attributes are not distinct from his essence?
Yes, I remember al-Ghazali pushing back against that idea, saying that it strips God of any meaningful attributes.
Exactly, and Ibn Rushd picks up that thread, arguing that this very concept of divine simplicity implies a different kind of knowing. He distinguishes between different levels of knowledge, arguing that God's knowledge is not like human knowledge, which is acquired through observation and experience. Instead, he says, God knows things in a way that transcends our limited human categories.
So it's not that God doesn't know the specifics of our lives, it's that his knowledge is of a different kind altogether.
Precisely. Ibn Rushd uses the analogy of light. Imagine a single ray of sunlight that illuminates an entire room. That single ray contains within it the light reflecting off every object in the room, even the tiniest dust particles. Similarly, he argues God's knowledge encompasses everything in its totality, past, present, and future, in a way that transcends our linear understanding of time and our limited capacity for observation.
That's a beautiful analogy. It helps me visualize how God's knowledge can be both universal and particular at the same time. It's not a matter of knowing either general concepts or specific details, but rather knowing everything in a way that encompasses both the big picture and the smallest nuances. It's like having a Google Earth view of reality, where you can zoom in to see the individual leaves on a tree and then zoom out to see the entire forest.
Exactly. And Ibn Rushd argues that this higher level of knowledge actually enhances God's attributes like justice and mercy, because God knows everything in its totality. He is able to judge and respond to each individual in a way that is perfectly just and compassionate, taking into account all the complexities of their circumstances and choices.
So instead of limiting God's justice and mercy, this understanding of divine knowledge actually elevates those attributes to a whole new level. It's like saying that a perfect judge doesn't just apply the law blindly. They consider all the mitigating factors, the nuances of each case before rendering a verdict.
Precisely. Ibn Rushd is suggesting that our human attempts to grasp the nature of God's knowledge are inherently limited. We can't box it in with our finite concepts or try to fit it into our linear understanding of time.
So on the question of God's knowledge, we see these two brilliant minds, al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, grappling with the same theological problem, but arriving at different conclusions based on their differing philosophical frameworks and their interpretations of Scripture. It's like they're looking at the same tapestry but focusing on different threads, each revealing a different aspect of its intricate design.
That's a great observation. And this pattern continues as we explore their different perspectives on other key issues, such as the nature of causality and miracles. Remember our discussion of how the philosophers tended to interpret miracles as natural phenomena that we simply don't yet understand?
Yes, I remember you comparing their approach to that of a magician's trick, seemingly impossible but ultimately explainable within the laws of physics.
Exactly. Well, Ibn Rushd, while remaining committed to a worldview that emphasizes reason and natural law, actually affirms the possibility of miracles. But, true to form, he offers a nuanced interpretation of what constitutes a miracle and how it fits within the framework of a universe governed by natural laws.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does Ibn Rushd reconcile the concept of miracles with his commitment to a rational understanding of the universe? Does he try to explain them away as just really unusual natural events?
He doesn't deny that there are events that occur in the world that seem to defy our current understanding of natural causes, but he argues that this doesn't necessarily mean that natural laws have been broken. Instead, he suggests that what we perceive as miracles may be the result of natural causes that are simply beyond our current scientific understanding. He even speculates that there might be higher order natural laws at play, laws that govern the interactions between the spiritual and physical realms.
So he's leaving open the possibility that there are forces at work in the universe that we haven't even discovered yet, forces that might explain what we perceive as supernatural events. It's like saying that 1,000 years ago, people might have considered electricity a miracle because they didn't understand the laws of electromagnetism.
That's a great example. Ibn Rushd is essentially saying that the boundaries of what we consider natural are constantly expanding as our scientific knowledge grows. What seems miraculous today might be perfectly explainable tomorrow once we've unlocked the secrets of these higher order laws that govern the universe.
Okay, so he's not a supernaturalist throwing out the laws of physics whenever something extraordinary happens. He's a rationalist pushing the boundaries of what we consider natural, acknowledging that our current understanding is limited. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Precisely. And Ibn Rushd goes on to argue that these higher order laws, while currently unknown to us, are still ultimately under the control and direction of God. So miracles, even if they involve extraordinary natural phenomena, are still expressions of divine will.
So it's not a matter of God versus nature, but rather God working through nature sometimes in ways that seem to defy our expectations. It's a both-hand perspective, not an either.
Exactly. Ibn Rushd is trying to bridge the gap between reason and revelation, between the seemingly miraculous and the scientifically explainable. He's offering a framework that allows for both the awe and wonder of the extraordinary and the intellectual satisfaction of understanding the universe through the lens of reason.
This has been an incredibly illuminating exploration of the debate between al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. It's amazing to see how these two intellectual giants wrestled with the same fundamental questions, drawing on both scripture and philosophy, and yet arrived at such different conclusions. But I'm curious, did this back and forth actually resolve anything? Or did they just end up talking past each other?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is a bit of both. On the one hand, al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd represent two distinct intellectual approaches, two different ways of understanding the relationship between reason revelation and the pursuit of truth. They came from different philosophical backgrounds, had different interpretations of scripture, and emphasized different aspects of Islamic tradition.
So it's not surprising that they didn't always see eye to eye on these complex theological issues.
Right. But on the other hand, I think this debate actually helped to enrich Islamic intellectual discourse. It forced both sides to clarify their arguments, to refine their methodologies, and to develop more sophisticated and nuanced understandings of these challenging theological issues.
So even though they didn't necessarily agree on the answers, they both contributed to a deeper and more rigorous exploration of the questions. They pushed each other. And in doing so, they pushed the entire field of Islamic philosophy and theology forward.
Precisely. And I think that's a valuable lesson for us today as we navigate a world of increasingly polarized opinions and ideologies. We can learn from al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd how to engage in respectful disagreement, to challenge each other's ideas while remaining committed to the pursuit of truth. Their debate wasn't about scoring points or proving the other side wrong. It was about deepening understanding, refining arguments, and ultimately contributing to a richer and more nuanced understanding of Islamic thought.
It's a reminder that intellectual progress often comes through dialogue and debate, through the willingness to listen to opposing viewpoints and to grapple with difficult questions. It's not about silencing dissent or clinging to dogma, but about engaging in a genuine search for truth, recognizing that our understanding is always evolving, always open to revision.
Absolutely. And I think the enduring legacy of this debate is evident in the way that Muslim thinkers, even today, continue to wrestle with the questions raised by al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. Their works are still studied and debated in Islamic seminaries and universities around the world, inspiring new generations of scholars to engage with these timeless questions.
It's a testament to the power of these ideas, their ability to transcend time and place and to continue to provoke reflection and discussion. They remind us that the pursuit of knowledge, especially knowledge of the divine, is not a passive endeavor. It requires us to engage actively, to ask challenging questions, to wrestle with different perspectives, and to ultimately arrive at a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. And as we conclude this exploration of the incoherence of the philosophers and its aftermath, I encourage you, our listeners, to reflect on the enduring questions raised by this debate. How do we reconcile faith and reason? What are the limits of human knowledge? How do our conceptions of God shape our understanding of the world and our place in it? These are questions that have no easy answers, but they're questions worth pondering, wrestling with, and perhaps even finding our own unique responses to.
Beautifully put. And if there's one thing I've learned from this deep dive, it's that the quest for knowledge, especially knowledge of the divine, is not a solitary pursuit. It's a journey best undertaken in community, in dialogue with others, in a spirit of both intellectual rigor and open-hearted humility. So let's continue the conversation exploring these ideas, further seeking knowledge wherever it may lead us.
Thank you for joining us on this intellectual adventure.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the rich and fascinating world of Islamic thought.